The coldest truth about Lewis and Clark is that they did not enter an empty wilderness. In 1804, they moved through a world already shaped by native memory, trade, language, and generations of knowledge. Yet history often remembers that land as though it began when outsiders described it. When one version survives and countless others fade, what has truly been discovered? So what did Lewis and Clark really see in 1804, and why was it not what you think? For many people, the journey of Lewis and Clark begins with a simple picture. Two determined explorers leave the settled world behind and move westward into a vast unknown. Ahead of them lie unbroken rivers, distant plains, unfamiliar animals, and a landscape waiting to be named. This image is easy to remember because it gives history a clear beginning. There is a map with blank spaces, a small boat moving against the current, and a nation looking beyond its old borders. The farther the expedition travels, the more the land seems to open before it. In this familiar telling, discovery appears to happen at the moment an American officer writes something down. A river becomes real when it enters a journal. A mountain becomes known when it appears on a map. A plant becomes important when it is collected, measured, and carried east. The story feels orderly, but the real world of 1804 was not orderly in that way. Lewis and Clark did enter places that were poorly understood by officials in Washington. They faced distances, weather, currents, illness, uncertainty, and many practical dangers. Their journals preserved valuable observations, and their route demanded endurance. None of that needs to be denied. Yet the meaning of their achievement changes when we notice what the familiar picture leaves outside its frame. The Missouri River was not flowing through a human silence. Its banks, crossings, islands, and tributaries had long been known to people whose lives were tied to water, grasslands, animals, seasons, and trade. Long before 1804, generations had learned where boats could pass, where currents became dangerous, where food might be found, and where one community's territory approached another. The expedition entered that older human geography even when its official maps did not show it. This is where the familiar story begins to turn. A blank place on a government map can create the impression that nothing existed there before the mapmaker arrived. But blankness on paper is not the same as emptiness on the ground. It may only reveal the limits of the person holding the paper. The names used by local communities, the paths remembered through repeated travel, and the knowledge carried through families could remain invisible to distant officials while being essential to those who lived there. From the beginning, the expedition moved between these two realities. One was the official reality of a young United States seeking information about lands newly claimed through diplomacy. The other was a much older reality shaped by human movement, settlement, conflict, cooperation, memory, and adaptation. The men in the boats often saw landscapes through the expectations they carried from the East. They looked for routes, resources, possible trade, and signs of national advantage. They also looked with curiosity, discipline, and sometimes genuine wonder. But no observer arrives without a frame. What appears wild to one person may be home to another. What appears unnamed may already hold several names. What appears untouched may bear the quiet results of burning, planting, hunting, harvesting, and seasonal movement. Even the idea of entering the unknown depends on whose knowledge is being counted. For the expedition, uncertainty was real. For many people along the river, the land itself was not unknown at all. That removal may happen quietly, not through a deliberate lie, but through repetition. Paintings, schoolbooks, monuments, and simplified retellings can preserve the courage of the travellers while reducing the people already present to background figures. Over time, the expedition becomes the beginning of the land's story, rather than one moment within an older story. This difference does not make the journey meaningless. It makes the journey more human, because it places Lewis and Clark inside a world rather than above it. The old picture shows them moving into empty space. The fuller picture begins with the harder and quieter task of noticing whose memory disappears whenever history simply calls a place undiscovered. A map can create silence where life is already present. In 1804, officials in the United States could look westward and see uncertainty spread across paper. Rivers were incomplete, distances were doubtful, mountain ranges were poorly placed, and many routes were missing. To the eye of a government planner, these gaps looked like evidence of an unknown world, yet the land itself was not waiting for knowledge to arrive. People had crossed it, named it, hunted within it, farmed near it, traded across it, and remembered it through generations. The difference was not between knowledge and ignorance in an absolute sense. It was between different systems of knowledge, only one of which had been transferred onto the maps used in Washington. A line drawn in ink could show where an American surveyor believed a river flowed, but it could not easily contain the seasonal memory of someone who knew when that river flooded, where its banks became soft, or which crossing remained safe after heavy rain. A printed map could mark distance, but it could not always express how long a journey felt when measured by wind, current, cold, hunger, or the movement of animals. For communities living along the Missouri, geography was not a collection of empty shapes. It was part of daily survival. Knowledge remained attached to places where food could be gathered, where villages stood, where enemies might appear, where relatives lived, and where trade brought unfamiliar goods from far beyond the horizon. Such information was carried through speech, repeated travel, memory, and shared practice. It did not need to resemble a European map in order to be precise. Lewis and Clark entered this landscape with instruments, notebooks, and official instructions, but they also depended on conversations, gestures, interpreters, traders, and local guidance. Every mile revealed how limited a distant map could be. A bend in the river that seemed insignificant on paper might determine an entire day of labor. A village that had no place on an American chart might be a major center of exchange. A route unknown in the east might already connect many communities through long habits of movement. The expedition's task was therefore not simply to uncover a world that no one understood. It was also to translate selected parts of an existing world into a form that the United States could use. Translation always changes what it carries. Local names might be replaced, shortened, altered, or ignored. Distances described through travel could become measurements. Living territories could become boundaries. Places understood through stories, kinship, and seasonal use could be reduced to symbols. None of this means the resulting maps had no value. They helped record a difficult journey and expanded geographic knowledge within the United States, but their usefulness should not be confused with the birth of knowledge itself. The most important question is not whether Lewis and Clark knew little before they departed. They did. The deeper question is why later generations so often treated their lack of knowledge as proof that no knowledge existed. That confusion shaped the popular image of the expedition. It allowed the viewer to see courageous travelers moving through blankness instead of visitors entering a landscape filled with memory. It also made discovery appear to belong to the first person who could report a place to a distant government. In that sense, the blank map did more than show uncertainty. It quietly decided whose understanding would count as history. What remained beyond the page was a human landscape whose paths had been tested, whose seasons had been watched, and whose meanings could never be captured fully by ink, distance, or measurement alone. When Lewis and Clark looked across the Missouri country in 1804, they saw many things for the first time. But first sight and first knowledge are not the same event, and the distance between them is where the familiar story begins to change. The first quiet contradiction appeared before the expedition had travelled very far. Lewis and Clark were sent west to gather knowledge, yet they could not move safely through the Missouri country by relying on their own knowledge alone. They carried instruments, military discipline, written orders, and a strong sense of national purpose. But the river demanded another kind of understanding, one built through repeated contact with currents, weather, villages, animals, and people. The farther they moved from familiar settlements, the more clearly their success depended on information that had not begun with them. Traders supplied warnings and reports. Interpreters helped words cross between languages. Native communities described routes, distances, neighbouring peoples, and the conditions ahead. Even when these contributions entered the journals only briefly, they shaped decisions that affected every boat, every camp, and every day of travel. This dependence does not reduce the skill of the expedition. It reveals the world in which that skill operated. Human beings had been adapting to the river long before the core of discovery appeared upon it. They knew how the seasons changed its depth, where game gathered, how travel slowed under certain winds, and where diplomacy mattered as much as physical strength. The expedition's official purpose treated the West as a place to be examined, but the people already there encountered it as home, inheritance, responsibility, and memory. These two ways of seeing could occupy the same landscape without carrying the same meaning. A wide plain might appear to an American observer as open territory with future economic value. To a local community, that same ground could be connected to food, movement, danger, kinship, or an agreement with another group. A river junction might look like a useful point on a map, while also serving as a familiar meeting place within a much older network. The expedition recorded what its members could recognize and what their instructions asked them to notice. Yet every act of observation selected some details and left others outside the page. This is why the word discovery must be handled carefully. It may describe the moment when information became available to a particular government or scientific audience. It does not necessarily describe the beginning of human knowledge. When later generations forget this distinction, they can turn a limited point of view into a complete account of the past. The travelers become the central figures, while those who informed, fed, guided, challenged, or interpreted for them become supporting characters in their own lands. The contradiction grows stronger when we remember that the expedition was both vulnerable and powerful. Its members were vulnerable because they depended on local food, local information, and peaceful passage. They were powerful because they represented a nation that intended to map, trade with, and eventually influence the region. In 1804, those two conditions existed together. A small group of tired men could struggle against the current while carrying messages of authority from a distant president. They could need help from communities whose political independence their government did not fully understand. They could admire the abundance of a landscape while also measuring its usefulness for a growing country. Nothing about this contradiction was simple enough to fit inside the older picture of heroic travelers and empty land. It does not tell us that every meeting was hostile, nor that every observation was false. It tells us that the expedition entered a human world whose depth could not be captured by the idea of first sight. The answer cannot be found only in what they wrote, because it also lies in the older paths, names, relationships, and memories that their writing could preserve only partially, unevenly, and indirectly. Before asking what Lewis and Clark really saw, we must remain with this uncertainty a little longer. Were they opening an unknown continent, or were they beginning to translate an already known world into the language of another nation? Thomas Jefferson did not send Lewis and Clark west merely to satisfy curiosity or to complete a dramatic journey toward the Pacific. The expedition began inside a much larger national question. The United States had recently acquired an immense territory through the Louisiana Purchase, but ownership on paper did not produce immediate knowledge of the land, the rivers, the people, or the political relationships already present there. Officials in Washington could claim authority over a region they had never seen clearly and could not yet describe with confidence. Jefferson wanted information that would reduce that uncertainty. He instructed Meriwether Lewis to examine the Missouri River and search for the most practical connection with waters flowing toward the Pacific, especially a route that might support commerce across the continent. The hope was not based on a precise understanding of Western geography. Like many people of his time, Jefferson still imagined that river systems might provide a relatively direct passage through the interior. The expedition would eventually reveal how difficult that idea was, but in 1804 it remained an important reason for moving upstream. A usable route could carry goods, connect distant markets, and strengthen the position of the young nation in a region where British, French, Spanish, American, and native interests already overlapped. The boats therefore carried more than food, weapons, tools, and scientific instruments. They carried a commercial vision of the future. Every tributary, portage, current, and possible crossing could matter because geography would shape which people controlled movement and trade. Jefferson also ordered the expedition to learn about the native nations along the route, including their locations, populations, languages, alliances, trade patterns, and relationships with neighboring communities. These instructions reflected practical concerns as well as intellectual interest. The government wanted diplomatic contact, but it also wanted to redirect commerce toward the United States and away from rival powers. Lewis and Clark were expected to announce a new political reality created by the Louisiana Purchase, even though the people they met had not participated in that transaction and did not necessarily share the American understanding of what had been purchased. This difference would remain beneath many encounters during the journey. A meeting beside the river could appear peaceful while carrying several meanings at once. For the expedition, gifts and speeches might represent the extension of American friendship and authority. For a native leader, the same exchange might be understood through older traditions of alliance, trade, hospitality, or strategic negotiation. The travelers were therefore not simply moving across distance. They were entering political worlds with their own histories and expectations. Their task also included careful observation of plants, animals, minerals, climate, soil, and the character of the land. These records would help transform an unfamiliar territory into organized knowledge that could be studied and used in the East. Science was a genuine purpose, and the journals remain valuable because the expedition recorded so much with unusual patience. Yet science, commerce, and national ambition were not separate roads. They moved together in the same boats. To identify a plant was to add to natural knowledge, but also to consider whether it might be useful. To map a river was to clarify geography, but also to make future travel, trade, and settlement easier. To describe a village was to preserve an observation, but also to provide the government with political information. The journey toward the Pacific was real, but it was only the visible edge of the assignment. Beneath it lay a quieter effort to convert distance into knowledge, knowledge into access, and access into lasting national power. This was why the river ahead could never be treated as a neutral road. Each mile brought the expedition into lands where communities had created systems of exchange and survival. Jefferson's assignment began with maps and instructions, but its consequences would unfold wherever those ambitions met older claims, enduring memories, and older ways of belonging. The instructions carried westward joined three ambitions that can appear separate when viewed from a distance: science, commerce, and national power. On the river, however, they were woven together. Lewis and Clark were expected to observe with care, to record what they encountered, and to send home information that could be understood by people who would never see the Missouri. They noted the course of waterways, the condition of soil, the changing weather, and the plants and animals around their camps. They preserved specimens when circumstances allowed, and described unfamiliar species in the language available to early 19th century natural history. Such work required patience. A journey measured in difficult miles also became a long sequence of small acts of attention, examining a leaf, estimating the width of a stream, watching the habits of an animal, or comparing the direction of one tributary with another. These observations had genuine scientific value, yet Jefferson's instructions did not treat nature as knowledge alone. The same river that interested a geographer might become a commercial route. The same animal studied by a naturalist might also be connected to food, hides, or the fur trade. Fertile ground could be admired as landscape while being evaluated for future use. Knowledge became valuable partly because it could guide later movement. This did not mean that every entry in the journals concealed an immediate plan of settlement. The men often recorded what surprised them simply because it was new to their experience. Still, they travelled as representatives of a government, and their notebooks were intended to return to that government. What they saw could become information for officials, merchants, mapmakers, and future travellers. Their scientific labour therefore existed inside a national project. The expedition also gathered details about the communities along the route. Lewis and Clark were asked to learn about languages, trade connections, political relationships, and the places where different nations lived. From the perspective of Washington, this information might help create peaceful relations and encourage commerce with the United States. From the perspective of the people beside the Missouri, the arrival of armed strangers bearing medals, flags, gifts, and speeches could be understood through local systems of diplomacy that had developed over generations. No single ceremony guaranteed a shared meaning. The expedition might announce a new national authority, while its listeners understood the meeting as an offer of alliance, an exchange between leaders, or another moment within older rivalries and trading partnerships. This gap mattered, because trade was never only the movement of objects. Goods followed relationships. Metal tools, cloth, weapons, food, horses, and information traveled through networks supported by trust, need, negotiation, and power. The United States hoped to enter and redirect some of those networks, but it had not created them. Long before the expedition, communities had adapted their lives to river valleys, grasslands, seasonal resources, and routes that connected distant regions. The newcomers were observing a human system as much as a natural one. Their records could describe villages and count lodges, but numbers alone could not explain how kinship, memory, obligation, and danger shaped movement across the land. This is the quieter meaning of Jefferson's assignment. Measurement promised clarity, but clarity could also make a distant place easier to approach, organize, and influence. A mapped channel could support later boats. A recorded village could become a point in diplomatic planning. A list of resources could awaken commercial interest. Science did not automatically become conquest, and curiosity was not the same as deception. Yet knowledge gathered under national authority rarely remained neutral once it returned home. The page could preserve a moment faithfully while still carrying that moment into decisions the original observers could neither predict nor fully control. In 1804, every careful observation rested between two times: the older world that had made survival possible along the Missouri, and the future world that American maps, markets, and policies were beginning to imagine. To observe a place is never only to look at it. Observation creates a record, and a record can travel farther than the person who made it. When Lewis and Clark measured a river, described a village, noted the soil, or recorded the location of a tributary, they were preserving details unknown to officials in the East. Yet they were also making the Missouri country more legible to a distant government. A place that had once appeared as uncertainty on a map could now be entered into reports, compared with other locations, and considered in plans for trade or diplomacy. This was not possession in the simple sense of planting a flag and instantly controlling the land. The expedition did not command the region through which it moved, and its members depended upon the cooperation of people whose authority was local, established, and real. Still, measurement carried a quiet political force. To describe a river accurately was to make later travel easier. To identify a village was to place its people within the government's field of attention. To list resources was to invite questions about how those resources might be reached, exchanged, or used. The journals did not create these rivers, communities, animals, or plants, but they carried selected knowledge of them into an expanding national system. That movement of knowledge matters because states often begin by seeing before they begin by governing. They collect names, routes, distances, populations, languages, and relationships. Such information can support negotiation, but it can also reduce uncertainty for merchants, soldiers, surveyors, and settlers who may arrive later. Lewis and Clark were not personally directing every consequence of their work, and it would be inaccurate to treat each observation as a hidden plan of conquest. They recorded many things from curiosity and scientific discipline, yet their notebooks belong to a mission authorized by the President, funded by Congress, and designed to serve the interests of the United States. The meaning of the expedition, therefore, cannot be separated from the institution that sent it. This becomes especially clear when names enter the story. Naming can honor a person, mark an event, or help travelers remember a place. It can also place a new layer of language over older names already used by people who know the landscape intimately. When an expedition gives an English name to a river or landmark, later maps may preserve that name while local words fade from official memory. The physical place remains unchanged, but its identity begins to shift. A new name can make the land seem newly known, even though the knowledge beneath it may be ancient. Human beings had shaped their lives around the Missouri through generations of movement, farming, hunting, exchange, and adaptation. The expedition encountered the results of that long relationship, but official records could preserve only fragments of it. What became visible to Washington was often what could be measured, classified, translated, or written down. What remained harder to record included the emotional meaning of a homeland, the memory carried in a local name, the obligations connecting families, and the knowledge learned through a lifetime of seasonal change. These limits do not make the journals useless. They make them historical documents rather than transparent windows. They show what disciplined observers noticed, what their instructions emphasized, and what their language allowed them to describe. They also reveal how a young nation began converting a living region into organized knowledge. In that conversion, science and power did not need to oppose each other. They could occupy the same sentence, the same map, and the same measurement. As the year 1804 progressed, Lewis and Clark had not taken possession of the Missouri world, but they had begun carrying it into the administrative imagination of the United States. The deeper question is whether a land becomes owned when someone reaches it or when another power learns how to describe it. When Lewis and Clark pushed their boats against the current of the Missouri, they were not entering a silent waterway. The river was already a road, though it did not resemble the roads familiar to people in the eastern United States. It carried canoes, food, tools, stories, warnings, and news between communities separated by long distances. Its bends and tributaries linked villages, hunting grounds, seasonal camps, and places of exchange. To people who lived near it, the Missouri was not simply a line through the landscape. It was a moving structure around which life had been organized for generations. The river provided water and fish, but it also shaped travel, settlement, conflict, and cooperation. Its changing depth could decide when a journey was possible. Its islands could offer temporary shelter. Its banks could become fertile places for cultivation, while its floods could alter familiar ground. Knowledge of these changes came from repeated experience rather than from a single survey. A person learned the river by returning to it in different seasons, by listening to older travelers, and by remembering where danger or opportunity had appeared before. The expedition could measure direction and estimate distance, but those measurements were only one layer of understanding. Local knowledge included the rhythm of the current, the location of usable timber, the presence of game, and the approach to communities whose friendship or hostility mattered. Such knowledge had accumulated through human adaptation to the Missouri environment. Long before the American boats appeared, people had adjusted their movement to the river's moods and had built relationships across the spaces it connected. Some communities lived in settled villages and cultivated crops near the water. Others moved according to seasonal needs while maintaining ties to particular regions and trading partners. These different ways of life were not isolated from one another. The river helped bring them into contact. Goods could pass from one group to another through several exchanges, traveling farther than the individuals who first carried them. Information moved in the same way. A report about strangers, disease, conflict, animals, or distant markets could travel along the Missouri before the expedition reached the places being discussed. This meant Lewis and Clark were entering a world where their arrival could be anticipated, interpreted, and compared with earlier encounters. The men may have felt they were moving deeper into uncertainty, but the river ahead was not without memory. Every village had its own understanding of who traveled nearby, which routes were useful, and how relations with neighboring peoples had changed over time. Even places that seemed empty during a single day might instead belong within a larger seasonal pattern. A quiet bank could have been used at another time for gathering, hunting, ceremony, or rest. The absence of people in one moment did not prove the absence of human connection. This is why the Missouri cannot be understood only as the route chosen by the expedition. The expedition became one temporary movement within a much older circulation of human life. Its boats were new to many eyes, and its political message was tied to a growing nation, but the act of moving along the river was not new. People had already learned how water joined distant worlds, how travel created obligation, and how access to the river could shape power. The deeper Lewis and Clark went, the more they depended on a road they had not built and a geography whose human meaning had begun long before their journals opened. What appeared from the boat as open water was therefore already within a network of decisions made by travellers before them. They had chosen landing places, remembered crossings, carried crops and tools, and taught younger generations how to read the river without instruments. Their knowledge did not always survive in written form, but it survived in movement. In 1804, the Missouri was already bearing the weight of human history. Lewis and Clark were not the first outsiders to move along the Missouri, and the information they carried west did not begin in Washington. For decades before 1804, traders connected with French, Spanish, and British commercial systems had travelled through portions of the river valley, seeking furs, alliances, and access to distant markets. Some lived for long periods near native communities. Others returned east or south with reports about villages, routes, languages, river conditions, and political relationships. Their knowledge was incomplete and sometimes mistaken, but it had already weakened the idea that the interior was entirely unknown to Europeans and Americans. Near Street, Louis, Lewis, and Clark entered a borderland where languages, governments, and commercial interests had overlapped for years. French remained widely used in local trade. Spanish officials had recently governed Louisiana, while British traders continued to influence networks reaching toward the upper Missouri from the north. The United States arrived not at the beginning of this history, but during a transfer of imperial authority that looked clearer in treaties than it did on the ground. Before departing, the expedition consulted people who understood parts of the river through practical experience. James Mackay and John Evans had travelled far up the Missouri during the 1790s under Spanish sponsorship. Their observations and maps provided useful knowledge about the river and the peoples living along it. Lewis and Clark could therefore begin their journey with a representation of much of the lower and middle Missouri that had been shaped by earlier travel. Even that earlier information did not stand alone. Traders learned from native guides, hosts, partners, and communities whose geographic understanding was older than the commercial ventures entering the region. Knowledge passed through many hands before it reached the expedition's notebooks. A river bend might be copied from a trader's map, but the trader may first have learned its importance from someone who had travelled there since childhood. A village location might appear in a European report because local people had explained where neighbouring communities lived. The written record often preserved the name of the person who carried information toward colonial officials, while leaving less visible the people from whom that information had come. This pattern matters because it changes the meaning of what Lewis and Clark saw. Their eyes were guided by expectations built from earlier reports. They searched for places already described to them, compared the river with existing maps, and asked questions shaped by commercial and political concerns inherited from previous visitors. At the same time, the realities they encountered could correct those expectations. Currents shifted, distances proved different, and relationships between communities could not be reduced to old summaries. The expedition was observing directly, but it was never observing from a state of complete innocence. It moved through layers of prior contact. Metal goods, cloth, weapons, and other traded objects had already entered many native economies through routes extending far beyond the Missouri. News of foreign powers could travel through exchange networks before their representatives arrived. Some people who met the expedition had experience dealing with traders and understood that newcomers often brought opportunities together with risks. They did not simply wait to be discovered. They evaluated strangers within political worlds formed by their own needs, memories, and alliances. The American boats were unusual, but outsiders seeking influence and trade were not entirely new. What made 1,804 different was the government represented by the travellers and the future that government imagined. Lewis and Clark followed paths prepared by earlier traders, while carrying a national claim more ambitious than a temporary commercial visit. Behind them stood maps, assembled from borrowed knowledge. Ahead of them stood communities capable of deciding how that claim would be received. That difference grew clearer with every encounter. The Missouri had already carried outsiders upstream, but it had never carried this precise combination of scientific instructions, diplomatic ceremony, military authority, and continental ambition. Information often travelled faster than boats. Long before Lewis and Clark reached a village, news could move through visitors, relatives, hunting parties, traders, and neighbouring communities. A message did not need a written page to cross the plains. It could pass from one language to another, change slightly with each telling, and still carry the essential fact that unfamiliar travellers were moving upstream. The expedition therefore advanced into places where its arrival might already be expected. The men could not assume that first sight worked in both directions. They might see a community for the first time while people there had already heard descriptions of their boats, clothing, weapons, gifts, or political speeches. The Missouri connected this flow of information because it joined settlements and routes extending far beyond the water visible from the expedition's deck. Along those routes moved corn, beans, dried meat, hides, horses, metal tools, cloth, guns, and other objects exchanged through several communities. An item could travel hundreds of miles without its original owner making the same journey. Knowledge moved in a similar way. Reports about traders, rival nations, disease, changing animal movements, or distant conflicts could pass through networks of kinship and commerce. No central authority controlled the entire circulation. It grew from repeated human contact, from practical needs, and from relationships built across generations. By 1804, communities along the Missouri were not isolated fragments waiting to be connected by the United States. They already belonged to overlapping worlds of exchange. Some links followed the river. Others reached across the plains toward people who possessed horses, toward northern traders connected with British commercial interests, or southward toward settlements influenced by French and Spanish activity. The exact reach of information varied, and no community knew everything beyond its homeland. Yet limited knowledge is not the same as isolation. Lewis and Clark themselves also knew the country through fragments. They carried maps assembled from earlier journeys, reports from traders, and descriptions gathered from people who had travelled farther than they had. As they moved upstream, they asked questions and compared answers. The knowledge entering their journals was often created through a chain of human transmission. A local traveller might describe a river to an interpreter, who translated it for a trader, whose account later reached an officer or mapmaker. By the time a line appeared on an American map, the names of the earliest contributors could be absent. The finished document might look like the product of a single expedition, even though its information had many origins. This pattern can be seen in the landmarks the travellers approached with prior knowledge. They sometimes recognized places because traders or earlier maps had already described them. Their journals then added measurements, observations, and new names, but the act of recording did not erase the older path by which information had reached them. The expedition was both a collector and a participant in the network. It received news, created news, and left reports behind as it travelled. Its speeches announced the authority claimed by the United States. Its gifts became objects that could be shown and discussed after the boats departed. Its appearance entered local memory before the captains could understand how their visit would be interpreted. This is another reason the image of lonely explorers entering silence fails. The silence existed mainly in distant archives, not along the river itself. Human beings had already built ways for knowledge to survive without printed maps or official reports. They remembered who lived beyond the next region, which relationships were dangerous, where trade might be possible, and how strangers had behaved before. The expedition carried a new national message into that moving field of information, but it did not create the field. What Lewis and Clark saw in 1804 had often been described before they arrived, while their own presence was already becoming a story moving ahead of them farther upstream still. To Lewis and Clark, many places along the Missouri appeared uncertain because they had not yet been fixed clearly on American maps. To the people who lived there, those same places were already held within language, memory, and repeated use. A river bend could carry a name connected to its shape, an event, an animal, or a nearby settlement. A stream might be known for the season when fish gathered there. A ridge could mark the edge of a hunting area, the direction toward relatives, or the beginning of a dangerous crossing. These meanings did not need to be printed to remain precise. They were learned by travelling, listening, returning, and noticing how the land changed through the year. For generations, human survival in the Missouri country depended on this close attention. People had to know where water remained dependable, where soil could support crops, where bison might move, and where winter conditions made travel difficult. The landscape was therefore not a blank surface waiting to receive official names. It was already divided by experience, obligation, and memory. Different nations could know the same place under different names, just as they could use the same river for different purposes. One community might approach a location as a trading ground, another as a route between seasonal camps, and another within a wider territory connected to ancestors and kin. These layers could overlap without fitting neatly into the boundaries later drawn by governments. When Clark recorded a feature on a map, he often translated a living place into a form that distant readers could understand. The resulting mark might be useful and accurate within the standards of surveying, yet it could not contain everything that made the place meaningful. A line could show the direction of a river, but not the stories that taught people when to trust its ice. A symbol could indicate a village, but not the relationships that joined its households to other communities far away. A written name could preserve one version while causing older names to disappear from later public memory. This was not always a deliberate act of erasure. Sometimes names changed because interpreters heard unfamiliar sounds imperfectly, because several languages were involved, or because mapmakers preferred words that were easier for English readers to repeat. Yet the effect could still be lasting. Once an American name entered official reports, later travellers often used it, and the map gradually made that name appear original. The older language did not vanish from the mouths of the people who remained, but it could vanish from the records that shaped national history. This difference is central to what Lewis and Clark really saw. They did not encounter an anonymous landscape. They encountered a landscape whose names were often hidden from them by distance between languages and by the limits of their mission. Their journals could record conversations, but only fragments crossed into English. They could ask where a river led, yet the answer might carry cultural meanings that no brief translation could preserve. The land itself remained the same, but the frame around it changed as each observation entered the expedition's archive. Human beings had already made the Missouri country knowable through long adaptation. They had linked places to food, danger, movement, and social memory. The expedition added another layer of naming, one connected to American science, government, and future travel. The question was not whether the new maps were useful. They were. The question was what became harder to see once those maps taught later generations to believe that a place began its history when an American name appeared beside it. Long before ink reached paper, people had already carried those places in speech, habit, and memory, teaching children how to recognize them not as distant points, but as elements of a deeply shared lived world where identity, survival, and belonging could never be separated from the ground. Before a landscape is drawn on paper, it can exist as a map inside human memory. People living along the Missouri did not need printed charts to know where they were. They learned direction through the course of rivers, the shape of hills, the position of the sun, the behavior of animals, and the distance a journey required under different conditions. A route could be remembered not as a straight line but as a sequence of places, a narrow crossing, a grove that offered shelter, a bend where the current became dangerous, a village where news could be exchanged, or a stretch of open ground that should be avoided in winter. This kind of geography was practical, detailed, and deeply connected to experience. It could be taught through spoken description, repeated travel, gesture, and demonstration. A person might explain a route by tracing it in the earth, arranging marks on a hide, or naming the communities encountered along the way. The accuracy of such knowledge did not depend on whether it resembled a European map. It depended on whether travelers could reach water, find food, avoid danger, and arrive where they intended to go. Lewis and Clark relied on this human geography more often than the familiar story suggests. When they asked about rivers beyond their view, mountain passes they had not reached, or nations living farther west, they received information shaped by people who had travelled those routes or heard reliable accounts from others. Some descriptions were later converted into sketches and written notes. Distances could be expressed through days of travel rather than fixed miles. Direction might be explained through the flow of water, the movement of the sun, or the sequence of neighbouring territories. The captains then translated these answers into the conventions of their own maps. That process could preserve valuable knowledge, but it could also narrow it. A spoken account might contain uncertainty, seasonal variation, social warning, and local meaning, while the finished map showed only a line and a name. Human memory was not perfect, and neither were instruments. Rivers changed course, villages moved, and estimates differed. Yet local knowledge had an advantage that no brief expedition could reproduce. It was tested over generations. People knew not only where a route lay, but when it could be used, who controlled access to it, and what obligations came with passing through. The expedition's measurements added another form of precision, especially in recording latitude, direction, and distance. Still, those measurements did not arise in an empty world. They were often guided by questions answered through older knowledge. A map made by Clark could therefore contain several layers at once: his own observations, earlier traders' reports, information from native travellers, and corrections gathered during conversation. The finished document might bear one name, but its knowledge had many authors. This matters because later generations often see a map as the achievement of the person who drew it. The hands and voices that supplied the route disappear behind the clean lines. A living chain of memory becomes an official object. What began as shared knowledge about survival and movement becomes information held by a government. The transformation is subtle, but its consequences are important. It changes who appears to know the land and who appears merely to inhabit it. In reality, the Missouri world had already been mapped many times in speech, habit, and memory before American ink gave those paths a new form. Lewis and Clark did not create geographic knowledge from nothing. They gathered fragments of a much older human understanding and placed them inside a system designed to travel east, where maps could influence decisions far beyond the people and places from which that knowledge had first come. The map was new in format, but much of the world it described had already been carried safely through generations of observation, shared memory, and practical human care. When information entered Clark's maps, it rarely arrived from a single source. Some of it came from his own daily observations as the expedition measured courses, estimated distances, and recorded the shape of the Missouri. Some came from maps prepared before departure, from reports by traders, and from conversations with people who knew regions the expedition had not yet reached. Native travelers described rivers beyond the horizon, the locations of villages, the direction of mountain ranges, and the routes connecting one people with another. Clark gathered these fragments and translated them into lines, names, and symbols that could be understood by officials and mapmakers in the East. The result was not a simple copy of local knowledge, nor was it an entirely independent creation. It was a new document made from many kinds of seeing. This is especially important because a finished map hides the conversations that produced it. A river appears as one continuous line, but the knowledge behind that line may have passed through several languages. A distant route appears firm on paper, although the original account may have described seasonal obstacles, uncertain distances, or political dangers that could not be shown easily. A village becomes a small mark, while the relationships that made it a center of agriculture, trade, and family life disappear into the surrounding space. Clark's skill also lay in organizing scattered information into a geographic picture that later readers could follow. Yet the clarity of that picture could make its many origins difficult to notice. During the winter near the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, the expedition had time to combine field notes with information gathered from residents and traders. Knowledge of the country farther west was not drawn from direct American observation alone. It included descriptions offered by people whose communities had traveled, exchanged goods, and maintained relationships across large distances. When those descriptions entered Clark's work, they became woven into an official record associated with the expedition. The map could then travel east without carrying every voice that had helped form it. This did not mean Clark intended to conceal his sources. His journals and notes sometimes acknowledged the people or reports from which information came. The deeper problem developed through later memory, when the completed map was treated as proof that the expedition had revealed an otherwise unknown world. To citizens of the United States, the improved geographic image was genuinely new. It corrected errors, clarified river systems, and provided a far more useful representation of the Western interior. But new knowledge for one audience was often translated knowledge from another. The distinction matters because maps do more than guide travelers. They teach readers how to imagine places they may never visit. A map centered on the expedition's route can make the land appear to unfold around the movement of American boats. Villages become stops along that route, and older roads appear only when they serve the journey being recorded. Human history is quietly arranged around the observer. For generations, however, the people of the Missouri had understood the same landscape from many centers rather than one. Their maps of memory began from homes, relatives, food sources, trading partners, and places of danger or obligation. Clark's maps placed some of that knowledge inside a different center, one located in the ambitions of the United States. What entered the map was valuable, but never complete. It preserved rivers, routes, and names while leaving much of the lived meaning outside its borders. Its authority came from measurement and publication, yet beneath that authority remained acts of teaching. A hand tracing a river, a traveller naming the next village, an elder recalling a crossing, and an interpreter choosing words that could carry a landscape between languages without ever carrying all of it. The map that later seemed to open the West was therefore also a record of knowledge crossing from one human world into another. The animals of the Missouri country did not appear all at once as a dramatic revelation. They entered the expedition's journals gradually, through distant movement in the grass, tracks near the river, fresh hides in a village, or meat brought into camp. Lewis and Clark had grown up in eastern landscapes where deer, bears, wolves, and many birds were already familiar. Yet as they moved north and west during 1804, familiar categories began to feel less certain. Some animals resembled species they knew but differed in size, colour, speed, or behaviour. Others seemed so unusual that the captains first described them by comparison, using words such as goat, antelope, or barking squirrel, because no established American scientific name was ready at hand. This was not careless observation. Comparison is one of the oldest ways human beings understand something unfamiliar. The expedition watched bodies, horns, eyes, feet, calls, and movement, then tried to place each creature within the natural history known in the East. On the open plains, bison could be present in numbers that changed the appearance of the land. Elk and deer supplied food for travelers, while beaver and other fur-bearing animals connected the river environment to older commercial networks. In September 1804, the men encountered pronghorn, animals whose speed and form did not fit neatly into the European categories they carried. They also stopped at a colony of small burrowing animals known to French-speaking traders as prairie dogs. The creatures' upright posture, warning calls, and underground homes held the captain's attention because they seemed both strange and carefully adapted to the grasslands. Yet the novelty belonged to the observers, not to the plains. Indigenous communities were already familiar with these animals through hunting, food gathering, clothing, trade, stories, and repeated attention to seasonal movement. They knew which species could be approached, which could become dangerous, where herds were likely to pass, and how changes in animal behavior might signal changes in weather or human activity. Such knowledge had developed through the long relationship between human bodies and the environments that sustained them. It also carried restraint. Survival did not depend only on finding animals, but on knowing when movement, breeding, weather, and scarcity made pursuit costly or unwise. A written scientific description could preserve visible characteristics, but it could not immediately reproduce the understanding formed by generations of watching an animal across its entire life cycle. This difference did not make the expedition's records unimportant. Lewis and Clark helped produce systematic descriptions that expanded zoological knowledge available to the United States. Their notes allowed readers far from the Missouri to imagine animals they had never seen, and some specimens were eventually sent east for further examination. Still, the language of discovery can conceal the human chain beneath those observations. A trader might provide a familiar local name. A hunter might explain where an animal lived. A native community might supply food, hides, or practical information that allowed the expedition to recognize what it was seeing. Once the description appeared in an official journal, however, the animal could seem to have entered knowledge only at that moment. The deeper reality was quieter. The plains had been read by human beings long before they were classified for American science. Tracks, migrations, calls, and feeding grounds were part of a living map tied to survival. Lewis and Clark were adding a new written layer to that map, not standing at its beginning. What looked from their boats like a natural world opening for the first time was also an older human world in which animals had already shaped movement, diet, tools, trade, and memory across countless ordinary days. The Missouri did not reveal itself only through animals. Its water, soil, plants, wind, and changing sky shaped every day of travel, and the expedition learned quickly that a landscape could not be understood by looking at its surface once. The river rose and fell, carried drifting timber, cut into banks, and shifted the channels through which the boats struggled upstream. Mud could hold the men back as firmly as distance. Strong winds sometimes stopped progress even when the current seemed manageable. Heat, rain, insects, and cold altered the pace of work, reminding the travellers that geography was not a fixed drawing but a physical force pressing against the human body. Lewis and Clark recorded these conditions because Jefferson had asked for useful knowledge about climate, soil, water, and the natural character of the country. Their notes helped describe a region that remained poorly understood by readers in the East. They examined whether land appeared fertile, observed the growth of trees and grasses, and noticed how vegetation changed as the expedition moved away from familiar environments. Cottonwoods lined portions of the river and supplied wood for fuel, repairs, and camps. Willows, shrubs, prairie grasses, fruits, roots, and cultivated plants appeared within different settings, each connected to moisture, season, soil, and human use. The captains approached many of these plants through the habits of early American science. They compared forms, described leaves and flowers, preserved specimens when possible, and considered whether a species might have practical value. Yet the plants were not waiting for scientific language before entering human life. Native communities had already learned which local materials could be eaten, stored, shaped, burned, woven, traded, or used in ordinary work. That knowledge had developed through generations of close attention, including careful recognition of seasonal change and the limits of particular places. The expedition could identify a plant as unfamiliar to Eastern science, while meeting people for whom it was part of a known landscape. This distinction becomes especially visible near villages, where the travellers encountered fields and stored foods that challenged the image of an untouched wilderness. Corn, beans, squash, and other crops did not appear by accident. They reflected sustained labour, selection, planning, and knowledge passed between generations. Soil had been worked, seeds had been preserved, and harvests had been organised around the needs of families and communities. The river valley was therefore not only a natural environment observed by passing outsiders, it was also a human environment shaped by planting, gathering, cutting, burning, travel, and settlement. Not every visible change can be assigned confidently to one practice or one people, and the journals did not always understand the histories beneath what they saw. Still, the presence of agriculture and long-used plant knowledge makes one fact difficult to ignore. Nature along the Missouri had never been separate from human adaptation. The expedition's measurements added an important written record, but a written record captured only a moment within much longer cycles. A description of dry ground could not explain every earlier flood. A note about scarce timber could not preserve all the choices that had shaped its use. A specimen pressed between sheets could show physical structure while losing the relationships that gave the plant meaning as food, material, trade, or memory. Lewis and Clark were learning to read the country through instruments and journals, while the people around them read it through experience carried in the body. Both forms of attention could be detailed, but they answered different needs. The captains wanted knowledge that could travel east and remain stable on paper. Local communities needed knowledge that could guide life through changing seasons. What the expedition called soil, weather, water, and vegetation was therefore more than a scientific inventory. It was the living foundation upon which generations had already built ways of surviving beside the Missouri. Their survival rested on knowledge that no brief journey could ever reproduce completely. The phrase, "new to science," can sound as though knowledge began when a specimen was measured, named, and placed inside a scientific system. In the case of Lewis and Clark, that phrase is useful only when its limits remain visible. The expedition produced careful descriptions of plants and animals unfamiliar to many scholars in the United States, and those records widened the natural history available to readers in the East. Yet the organisms themselves were not unknown in the places where they lived. Native communities had observed their movements, seasons, uses, dangers, and relationships with the land through generations of practical experience. A plant collected beside the Missouri might be new to an American botanical record, while already serving as food, material, medicine, or a seasonal sign within local life. An animal described in a journal might be unfamiliar to the captains, while its tracks, habits, and migrations were recognized by hunters who had followed it since childhood. The difference was not between people who knew and people who did not know. It was between forms of knowledge created for different purposes. Lewis and Clark needed descriptions that could travel east, survive on paper, and be compared with accepted scientific categories. Local knowledge needed to guide human beings through changing weather, scarce food, dangerous animals, and the responsibilities of community life. One system sought stable names and physical classification. The other often joined observation to place, season, memory, and use. Neither form should be romanticized as perfect. Scientific records could contain mistakes, and knowledge passed through experience could vary between individuals and communities. The important point is that the expedition did not begin human attention to Western nature. It entered a long history of attention and translated selected pieces into another language of authority. That translation could create lasting value. Detailed journals and preserved specimens allowed later naturalists to examine species beyond the expedition's route. They helped establish a broader picture of the continent's biological diversity. At the same time, publication often attached discovery to the names of the collectors, while the people who explained an organism or demonstrated its use remained unnamed. The finished record could therefore preserve the plant and lose part of the human relationship surrounding it. This loss was not merely a matter of recognition. It changed how later generations imagined the land. Nature appeared as an untouched collection waiting for trained observers, rather than an environment already read through farming, hunting, gathering, burning, travel, and careful seasonal judgment. The same caution applies to the word wilderness. A place may look uncultivated to a traveller who does not recognize local methods of caring for soil, plants, and animals. Human influence can be quiet, seasonal, and dispersed rather than enclosed by fences or permanent buildings. When those patterns are overlooked, the absence of familiar agriculture is mistaken for the absence of human history. In this way, a scientific description can be accurate in detail while the picture around it remains incomplete. The farther this image spread, the easier it became to separate the landscape from the people whose knowledge had helped make the expedition's survival possible. What Lewis and Clark saw was genuinely new to them, and often new to the scientific institutions they represented. Their curiosity and discipline deserve acknowledgement, but novelty belongs to a point of view. First description in one archive is not first encounter in human history. A species can enter a scientific catalogue after centuries of being known through another name, another practice, and another relationship with place. This distinction brings the central question closer without resolving it. The expedition's journals reveal a remarkable natural world, but they also reveal the boundaries of the observers. Every unfamiliar animal and plant stood at the meeting point of two histories, one beginning on the page and another already carried in language, labor, memory, and the accumulated experience of human bodies living beside the Missouri. When Lewis and Clark met native leaders along the Missouri in 1804, the meetings were not simple greetings between strangers, nor were they moments in which one side quietly accepted the meaning offered by the other. Each council took place inside political worlds that had existed before the expedition arrived, worlds shaped by trade, kinship, rivalry, memory, and the need to protect access to land and water. The captains carried speeches prepared around the authority of the United States, and they presented medals, flags, clothing, tobacco, and other gifts as signs of friendship, while also announcing that a new government now claimed influence over the vast territory acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. Yet the people listening had not taken part in that purchase, and there was no reason for them to understand a distant agreement between foreign powers as an automatic transfer of their own homelands. A medal bearing the image of an American president could be received as a valuable diplomatic object, a sign of possible trade, or evidence of a relationship with newcomers, without meaning that the recipient had surrendered political independence. The same ceremony could therefore contain several meanings at once, and this uncertainty followed the expedition from one meeting place to another. Lewis and Clark often arranged councils with formal speeches, military appearance, and carefully displayed objects, hoping to communicate peace while also making the strength and intentions of their nation visible. Native leaders listened through interpreters, answered according to their own concerns, and considered how the visitors might affect existing balances of power. Some communities wanted reliable trade, access to useful goods, or support against rivals, while others had reason to distrust promises from outsiders whose authority remained untested along the river. None of these responses can be reduced to simple welcome or resistance, because diplomacy required each community to judge what the expedition could actually offer and what dangers might follow behind it. They noticed the size of the party, the condition of its equipment, the quality of its gifts, the confidence of its speeches, and the limits of its knowledge. Before any promise could become meaningful, the newcomers had to be placed within patterns of exchange, obligation, danger, and memory that Washington neither controlled nor understood. The meetings also depended on translation, and translation was never a transparent bridge. Words such as chief, nation, father, peace, and sovereignty carried different histories in different political traditions, so a phrase that sounded clear in English could reach its listeners with another emphasis. Even when everyone wished to avoid conflict, they could leave a council believing that different agreements had been made. This gap between intention and understanding is central to what the expedition really saw, because Lewis and Clark did not encounter scattered individuals without political structure. They met leaders acting within communities that remembered earlier traders, maintained alliances, controlled resources, and negotiated movement through their lands. The Missouri itself made these councils necessary, since travel was not only a struggle against current and weather, but a passage through territories where human relationships could determine whether the boats received food, information, assistance, or opposition. Physical endurance alone could not carry the expedition forward. Survival required communication with people whose knowledge of the river was deeper and whose authority could not be erased by a speech. The captains may have believed they were introducing a new national order, but their immediate position was far more fragile because the power of the United States remained distant, while the people before them possessed local knowledge, numbers, food, and control of familiar ground. What appeared in later memory as a sequence of peaceful ceremonies was therefore a series of careful political encounters, each shaped by uncertainty about language, intention, and the future. Beside the river, the expedition was not simply describing native nations for a government report. It was being observed, measured, and interpreted by those nations in return. The objects Lewis and Clark carried into their councils were small enough to fit inside boxes, yet they were meant to represent a nation. Medals bearing the image of the president, flags marked with the symbols of the United States, coats, tobacco, tools, and other gifts were displayed with careful purpose. To the captains, these items helped make an invisible government present beside the Missouri. Washington was far away, but a medal could suggest a personal connection to its authority. A flag could mark friendship, while also expressing the claim that the land now stood within the influence of the United States. The expedition hoped that ceremony would turn political uncertainty into a clear relationship, yet an object never carries only the meaning intended by the person who gives it. Native leaders had long experience with diplomatic exchange, including gifts from French, Spanish, British, and other traders or officials. They could receive an American medal as another sign of alliance, prestige, or access to trade without accepting the wider claim that the president had become their ruler. A flag could be useful in one setting and carry little force in another. A coat might show status during future meetings, while tobacco could honor the immediate council. The objects entered older systems of exchange in which generosity created obligation, relationships required renewal, and gifts were judged by their quality as well as by the promises attached to them. Lewis and Clark often spoke of the president as a great father who wished peace among native nations. This language reflected diplomatic habits used by European and American powers, but it did not guarantee a shared understanding. Family terms could suggest protection and hierarchy to the speakers, while listeners might hear an offer of relationship that still required mutual responsibility. The captains also encouraged communities to trade with American merchants and to reduce conflict with neighboring peoples. Such requests sounded orderly within Jefferson's plans, yet local rivalries had histories that could not be ended by a single speech. Access to hunting areas, horses, trade routes, and military security shaped decisions more powerfully than distant instructions. A leader who accepted gifts could still pursue the needs of his own community after the expedition departed. The ceremony, therefore, did not transform the political world as quickly as the journals sometimes hoped. It created a temporary space in which strangers could speak without fighting, compare intentions, and test the value of future contact. Translation made every exchange more delicate. A message might pass from English into French and then into a native language, or through another chain depending on the people present. Each step required choices about words that did not match perfectly across cultures. The captains could believe they had announced sovereignty when the audience understood trade. A native speaker could describe an alliance or grievance that reached the journal in shortened form. Neither side needed to be dishonest for meaning to shift. Human language carries assumptions that remain invisible until people act on different interpretations. In this way, medals and flags reveal more than official symbolism. They show how the expedition tried to compress a distant nation into objects that could be held, worn, raised, and remembered. They also show the limits of that effort. The United States could distribute signs of authority, but authority itself depended on recognition, presence, and the ability to sustain relationships over time. Along the Missouri in 1804, local communities still controlled the knowledge, food, movement, and political choices that shaped the expedition's immediate future. The gifts were real, the ceremonies were serious, and the desire to avoid conflict often mattered to everyone present. Still, no medal could erase older loyalties, and no flag could make two political worlds mean the same thing by simply appearing between them. What looked like agreement on the riverbank could remain only a provisional understanding, awaiting proof through later conduct, trade, and memory. The councils beside the Missouri revealed a problem that neither ceremony nor goodwill could easily solve. Lewis and Clark spoke from a political tradition in which a government claimed territory through purchase, treaty, mapped boundaries, and recognition by other governments, while the native nations they met understood authority through their own histories of homeland, kinship, alliance, leadership, seasonal use, and negotiated access. These systems were not identical, and the same words could point toward different realities. When the captains announced that the United States now held the Louisiana Territory, they treated an agreement with France as a meaningful change in sovereignty. The people listening had not sold their homes to France, had not approved the purchase, and continued to exercise authority through established relationships on the ground. Accepting a council, smoking a pipe, receiving a medal, or expressing interest in trade did not necessarily mean accepting the American interpretation of ownership. It could mean recognizing visitors, opening communication, testing a possible alliance, or creating obligations that the newcomers might later be expected to fulfill. The expedition often wanted peace among neighboring nations because safer relations would support travel and commerce. Yet local conflicts could not be separated from competition over hunting regions, horses, trading access, security, and memories of earlier violence. A speech from a distant president could not remove those pressures. Leaders had to consider the needs of families who would remain after the boats disappeared upstream. They also had to judge whether American promises would carry weight once the gifts were used and the expedition was gone. The captains, meanwhile, sometimes interpreted formal hospitality as evidence that their message had been understood, though the outward calm of a meeting could conceal unresolved differences. Diplomacy often succeeds first by allowing people to postpone conflict, not by producing complete agreement. This was especially true when every important sentence passed through interpreters and through concepts that lacked exact equivalence. The United States could describe one man as the principal chief, while authority within his community might be distributed, situational, or dependent on persuasion rather than command. The captains might expect him to enforce peace or redirect trade, though he could not simply order every person to obey. Such misunderstandings made the political landscape far more complex than the physical map suggested. A river could be measured in miles, but influence could not be measured so easily. It changed from village to village, from season to season, and according to relationships invisible to passing observers, Lewis and Clark arrived with military uniforms and symbols of national authority, yet their immediate safety still depended on people who controlled local food, information, and movement. This balance prevented American claims from becoming instant reality. The expedition could announce possession, but it could not make that possession function through words alone. Human communities had created political order in the Missouri country long before 1804, and they continued to make choices according to that order after each council ended. Later retellings sometimes turned these encounters into peaceful steps in the natural expansion of the United States, but the meetings themselves were more uncertain. Beneath every courteous exchange remained the question of whether friendship could exist without submission, and whether either side recognized that distinction. They were moments when two political worlds touched without becoming one. Each side observed the other, weighed possible advantages, and interpreted gestures through memories the other side still understood incompletely. The captains saw nations they hoped to place within an American system of trade and diplomacy, while those nations saw travelers whose power remained distant and whose future behavior could not yet be known. What appeared to be a shared agreement was often only a narrow bridge across different meanings, strong enough for the expedition to continue, but not strong enough to settle who possessed the land, who could command peace, or whose understanding of the meeting would shape the history remembered afterward. Near the mouth of the river now called the Bad River, the expedition's progress became a direct test of power. In late September 1804, Lewis and Clark met Lakota people whom their journals called the Teton Sioux, The captains had heard warnings from traders and approached the meeting with caution, but caution did not mean understanding. They knew that the Lakota held an influential position along this portion of the Missouri, yet they saw that influence mainly as an obstacle to American travel and trade. The Lakota leaders before them saw a different situation. A large armed party was moving through a region where passage, exchange, and political relationships were already negotiated through local authority. The expedition could not simply declare friendship and assume that the river had become open. On September 25, the captains held a council with leaders including Black Buffalo, Partisan, and Buffalo Medicine. Speeches were delivered, medals and gifts were presented, and the visitors explained the authority they claimed to represent. The formal exchange resembled earlier councils, but unease remained beneath it. The expedition believed its gifts demonstrated goodwill and national importance. Some Lakota participants considered the offerings insufficient and pressed the travelers to remain longer or provide more. Later, when Clark took several leaders back toward shore after showing them the keelboat, young men held the cable of the smaller boat. One man clung to its mast, and Clark understood that the party was being prevented from leaving. Words and gestures hardened. Clark drew his sword. Lewis prepared the men aboard the keelboat, while Lakota warriors readied bows and firearms on the bank. For a short time, violence appeared possible at very close range, yet the encounter did not end in battle. Black Buffalo intervened, the cable was released, and the boats moved away before communication resumed. The restraint shown at that moment matters as much as the danger. Neither side could know exactly how far the other would go, and both had reasons to avoid losses that would bring little benefit. Later retellings sometimes reduce the event to brave explorers standing against a threatening group. That image preserves the fear recorded by the expedition but removes the political ground beneath it. The Lakota were not appearing without context to frighten passing strangers. They belonged to a regional system in which control over movement and trade carried practical value. Requests for gifts and demands concerning passage could express authority, expectation, and a wish to place newcomers inside established diplomatic rules. The captains, however, interpreted any restriction as a challenge to the freedom and status of the United States. Two different claims met beside the same water. One came from a government that had recently acquired Louisiana through an agreement made far away. The other came from people whose power rested on presence, mobility, relationships, and knowledge of the country itself. Human generations had made this stretch of the Missouri more than a channel through grassland. It was a political road, and roads are never free merely because an outsider wishes to use them. The expedition's weapons gave it defensive strength, but they did not erase its dependence on peaceful passage. The Lakota possessed numbers and local advantage, but open fighting could damage future exchange and bring unpredictable consequences. The standoff exposed the limits on both sides. Lewis and Clark could announce national sovereignty, yet they could not command immediate obedience. Lakota leaders could delay and pressure the expedition, yet their own aims were not perfectly united. The answer could not be settled by medals, maps, or speeches, because authority on the Missouri depended upon recognition and negotiation. What the captains saw was not a sudden eruption of irrational hostility. It was the visible edge of a political order they had entered without fully recognizing, where a rope held beside the river could ask who truly had the power to decide who moved and who remained. The tension near the Bad River cannot be understood without the trade system operating along the Missouri. The Lakota did not control every mile of the river as a modern government controls a border, but their influence over movement, exchange, and neighboring communities gave them real power. Traders who wished to pass through the region could be expected to offer goods, build relationships, and recognize local authority. From the Lakota perspective, the arrival of an American party carrying supplies was not simply the passage of neutral travelers. It was a political and commercial event that might alter connections. Lewis and Clark wanted the river open to American merchants, and they hoped to weaken patterns that linked native communities to British traders. They also wanted peace between the Lakota and the agricultural villages north, because conflict made commerce less predictable. These aims appeared reasonable within Jefferson's vision, but they threatened advantages held by people who benefited from the older arrangement. Lakota influence was connected partly to their position between distant sources of manufactured goods and communities seeking access to them. Horses, guns, metal tools, cloth, tobacco, and other objects could move through several exchanges before reaching their final users. The ability to guide, delay, tax, or interrupt that movement carried economic value. Gifts were therefore not decorations around a council. They helped define the relationship between visitors and hosts. When the captains offered items they considered adequate, Lakota leaders could judge them according to expectations formed through earlier dealings with traders. Dissatisfaction did not necessarily mean uncontrolled greed. It could express a belief that the expedition had failed to recognize the importance of the people whose cooperation it needed. The Americans, however, feared that yielding to demands would make them appear weak and encourage further challenges. Their military discipline required them to protect supplies and maintain freedom of movement. Each side therefore interpreted the same exchange through a different measure of status. The captains saw themselves as representatives of a powerful nation entitled to navigate territory acquired from France. Lakota leaders saw armed strangers entering a field of trade and authority that no distant purchase had erased. Behind the confrontation stood the agricultural communities of the upper Missouri, including the Arikara, whose villages were important centers of food and exchange. Lakota relationships with those communities included trade as well as tension. Lewis and Clark hoped to reshape such relationships by encouraging direct contact with American merchants and by presenting the United States as a new source of goods and political support. Yet the expedition had little ability to deliver that future. Its boats carried objects, but they could not guarantee regular trade. Its speeches promised friendship, but the government remained far away. The Lakota could evaluate the visitors by what was present before them, not by the national power that might arrive later. Human societies had long adapted to the Missouri not only by learning its currents and seasons, but by controlling access to the networks that followed it. Trade joined bodies to geography. A community with a position along a route could influence who received tools, food, animals, information, and protection. That influence could never be reduced to simple obstruction. It was a form of regional power created through generations of movement and negotiation. The encounter exposed what the expedition's maps could not show. A river drawn as an open line was crossed by invisible boundaries of reputation, obligation, and risk. Lewis and Clark believed free passage would serve a new national order. The Lakota had reasons to insist that passage still required recognition of the order already there. The near violence emerged because neither side wished to accept the political meaning demanded by the other. Beneath the raised weapons was a colder disagreement about trade itself, who would control its direction, who would receive its benefits, and whose permission mattered when strangers attempted to carry a new economy upstream. The confrontation ended without bloodshed, but it did not prove that the expedition had gained control of the river. Lewis and Clark continued upstream because negotiation, restraint, and the intervention of Black Buffalo created enough space for departure. Their boats moved on, yet the political order they had challenged remained in place behind them. Lakota influence did not disappear when the American flag passed beyond sight. Traders still had to consider local expectations. Neighboring villages still measured their security against Lakota power, and the Missouri remained a route governed by relationships that no distant purchase could instantly replace. The expedition possessed weapons, disciplined men, and written authority from the president, but these advantages had limits. Ammunition could defend a boat during a crisis, yet it could not supply reliable knowledge of every bend ahead. Military order could keep the crew together, yet it could not create food, interpreters, or peaceful relations with communities along the river. The men could refuse demands and display determination, but their survival still depended on avoiding a chain of conflicts they were too few to sustain. In that sense, continuing the journey was not the same as winning the confrontation. It was evidence that both sides had chosen, for their own reasons, not to carry the disagreement into violence. Black Buffalo's role in reducing the immediate danger also complicates the familiar image of the explorers forcing their way through opposition. The expedition's account naturally centers the fear and decisions of its own officers, but the outcome also depended on leadership among the Lakota. A local leader helped prevent an encounter on familiar ground from becoming a battle with uncertain losses. This did not make him an agent of American plans. It showed that Lakota political judgment could shape whether the strangers moved safely or remained trapped within escalating demands. The Americans were being acted upon as surely as they were acting. Their progress depended on choices made outside their command. After the boats departed, the captains could record the episode as a warning about the people they had met. Such judgments were influenced by the anxiety of the moment and by older reports from traders who viewed Lakota control as a barrier to their own interests. The Lakota, meanwhile, could remember an armed foreign party that offered limited gifts, rejected local demands, and claimed freedom to pass under the authority of a government still largely absent from the region. Neither memory had to be invented, but neither contained the whole encounter. Each arose from a different position on the same river. The episode also exposed a limit in the expedition's diplomatic method. Medals, speeches, and formal titles could open a meeting, but they could not settle who possessed the right to regulate travel. That right had grown from repeated presence, military reputation, trade, and memory. The captains carried symbols of a future order. The Lakota exercised influence within the existing one. For several days, those realities faced each other at close range, and neither could fully absorb the other. Without risking consequences, neither could predict. Human history often turns movement into proof of power. Because Lewis and Clark passed the bad river and eventually reached farther places, later stories can make their advance seem inevitable. In 1804, nothing about it was inevitable. A misunderstood gesture, an impatient order, or a weapon raised too quickly might have ended the expedition or changed its course. The fragile outcome reveals how little national claims meant without daily negotiation. The United States could imagine a continental future, but beside the Missouri, its representatives remained a small, vulnerable body of travelers moving through older territories. They had crossed a tense boundary without erasing it. What they truly saw was the distance between authority written in Washington and power practiced on the ground, where passage depended not on who owned the map, but on who could shape the next human decision. When Lewis and Clark reached the Arikara villages near the Grand River in October 1804, they did not find a scattered population drifting without fixed homes, but a settled world built around earth lodges, cultivated fields, stored food, and relationships extending far beyond the visible riverbanks. The villages stood as evidence that life on the northern plains could combine permanent residence with seasonal movement, because families tended crops near their homes while hunters also followed bison and gathered resources from the surrounding country. Corn, beans, squash, and tobacco were not accidental products of fertile ground, but the results of knowledge carried across generations, including the selection of seeds, the timing of planting, the protection of young plants, the organization of labor, and the preservation of harvests for winter. The growing season could be uncertain, with frost, drought, floods, and severe weather threatening the work of many months. Yet Arikara agriculture produced enough to sustain village life and create surpluses for exchange. This surplus helped make the villages important points within wider trading networks, where agricultural produce could be exchanged for hides, horses, tools, weapons, and other goods arriving through several communities. The expedition therefore entered towns whose economy depended on both the soil beside the Missouri and connections reaching across the plains. The earth lodges themselves expressed adaptation rather than simplicity, with timber, earth, and careful construction creating substantial homes suited to family life, storage, work, and protection from changing temperatures. Grouped together, these dwellings formed communities where knowledge, food, children, tools, and responsibility were shared through daily routines that a passing traveller could only partly observe. Defensive ditches and palisades also reminded the visitors that settlement brought vulnerability as well as stability. Because stored crops and strategic locations could attract trade, alliance, competition, and attack, nothing in this landscape supported the idea of a land without organized human history. The Arikara had shaped their lives through repeated decisions about where to build, when to plant, when to hunt, how much food to preserve, and how to maintain relationships with neighboring peoples. Their villages were not isolated islands, but centers where travelers brought news and where information about distant powers could be considered before those powers arrived. Lewis and Clark needed food, interpreters, diplomatic contact, and knowledge of the river ahead. So the people they encountered were not merely subjects to be described in a report. They were participants whose choices could affect the expedition's progress. The captains hoped to encourage peace between the Arikara and communities farther upstream, partly because safer relations would support American trade, but existing alliances and conflicts had grown from histories too deep to be rearranged by a few speeches. The expedition could offer medals, flags, and promises, while the village residents could evaluate whether those objects matched practical needs and remembered experience. Viewed from the boats, the towns may have appeared as remarkable stops within an American journey. Yet from within the towns, the expedition was only one arrival in a much longer sequence of visitors, traders, allies, and possible threats. Human beings had already transformed the river bottomlands into places where cultivated plants supported dense social life, where harvests connected one season to the next, and where children inherited skills needed to continue the community. Their presence also carried marks of earlier disruption, including epidemic disease linked to wider contact networks, which had reduced populations and altered village arrangements before the American party arrived. This loss did not erase Arikara society, but it shaped the communities the captains observed and reminds us that the expedition entered a world already changed by forces moving across the continent before official American expansion. What Lewis and Clark really saw was not wilderness briefly interrupted by settlement, but a settled landscape whose agriculture, architecture, commerce, and political memory revealed a form of civilization their popular image of the West would later make far too easy to overlook. By the time Lewis and Clark reached the Mandan and Hidatsa villages near the Knife River in the autumn of 1804, the world around them had become impossible to describe as empty. Several large Earth Lodge communities stood close enough to form a regional centre where agriculture, trade, diplomacy, and information met. Families cultivated corn, beans, squash, and sunflowers in the river bottoms, preserved food for winter, hunted beyond the villages, and maintained relationships with peoples living across the northern plains. These settlements were not temporary camps gathered around the arrival of the expedition, but established communities whose location and economy reflected generations of adaptation to the Missouri. The Earth Lodges sheltered households, tools, stored crops, and daily work, while the surrounding fields connected human survival to careful knowledge of soil, frost, rainfall, and seed. Farming here demanded planning across seasons, because the food harvested during warmer months had to support families when the river froze and travel became difficult. The villages also occupied an important position within broad networks of exchange. People came with horses, hides, meat, tools, weapons, cloth, and news from distant regions, allowing goods and information to move between communities that might never meet directly. Traders linked to French, British, and other commercial interests had visited the area before Lewis and Clark, so the American party entered a place already accustomed to evaluating outsiders. The captains saw villages that could provide food, interpreters, geographic knowledge, and diplomatic contact, but residents saw visitors whose promises had to be weighed against earlier experience. The expedition's medals and speeches announced a new national presence, yet the villages did not depend on the United States for their political meaning. They were centers in their own right, connected to alliances, rivalries, families, and trading routes older than the American claim to Louisiana. The Mandan and Hidatsa world also showed how misleading the familiar division between settled farmers and mobile hunters could be. Village agriculture existed alongside seasonal hunting and long-distance travel, with different activities supporting one another rather than forming separate ways of life. Human beings could remain rooted to homes and fields while moving through a wider landscape for animals, materials, exchange, and social obligations. The expedition had been taught to imagine the West through lines of rivers and possible routes, but here it encountered a geography organized around communities rather than around its own destination. Paths led toward villages because villages were sources of food, security, information, and relationship. The Missouri did not merely carry travelers past these settlements. It helped sustain a social world whose influence reached far beyond the visible banks. During conversations, the captains gathered descriptions of lands farther west and north, adding local and trader knowledge to maps that had reached their practical limit. This dependence revealed again that American exploration advanced through information produced by others. The people living near the Knife River had inherited knowledge of routes, neighboring nations, animal movements, and distant markets, and portions of that knowledge entered the expedition's records through translation. What later appeared as new geographic discovery was often an official reorganization of facts already moving through village life. Disease and earlier contact had brought severe disruption to communities of the upper Missouri before 1804, yet the villages remained active centers rather than remnants waiting to disappear. Their residents continued planting, trading, negotiating, raising families, and interpreting changes arriving from beyond the horizon. Lewis and Clark did not simply find shelter beside remote settlements. They reached one of the major human crossroads of the region. What they saw was a landscape whose density of knowledge and exchange challenged the idea that civilization moved only from east to west, because long before their boats arrived, these villages had already joined soils, rivers, bodies, crops, and distant peoples into an enduring center of life through routines refined across many generations of memory, labor, cooperation, adaptation, and careful seasonal judgment. Fort Mandan was built as a winter refuge, but the name can make the place sound more isolated than it was. The expedition selected a site downstream from the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in November 1804 and began raising log rooms, storage spaces, walls, and a gate before the deepest cold arrived. From inside the enclosure, the men could imagine themselves holding a small American position at the edge of the known world. Yet the fort did not stand alone in an empty country. It existed near communities whose fields, houses, trade, and knowledge made winter survival possible in ways the expedition could not create for itself. Mandan and Hidatsa people had permitted the visitors to remain nearby, and movement continued between the fort and the villages. Residents came to trade, speak, observe, seek assistance, or bring news. Expedition members travelled in the opposite direction to obtain food, attend gatherings, gather information, and maintain relationships that had to be renewed through conduct rather than speeches alone. Corn and other cultivated foods became especially important when hunting was difficult or weather-limited movement. Bison meat and robes also entered exchanges that helped bodies endure temperatures far beyond what many men had known before. The fort offered shelter, discipline, and a defensible position, but its walls could not produce nourishment or understanding. Beyond them stood the human network that reduced the danger of the winter. Cold made that dependence clearer. Rivers froze, wind crossed the open country, and routine tasks demanded greater effort. Hunting parties could return with little, injuries could become serious, and fuel had to be gathered continually. In such conditions, local experience mattered. People who had lived through many winters understood clothing, shelter, food storage, animal movement, and the practical rhythm of the season. The expedition learned by observing, asking, trading, and accepting help, even when the journals did not record every contribution in equal detail. Fort Mandan also became a place where information entered and left. Traders and village residents described nations, rivers, routes, and conditions farther west. Clark worked on maps during the winter, combining direct measurements with knowledge obtained through conversation. The captains prepared reports and specimens for the return party that would travel downstream in spring. At the same time, news about the Americans moved through the villages and beyond them. The fort was not a sealed container of American knowledge surrounded by silence. It was one point within a larger circulation of people and information. Here the expedition also met Toussaint Charbonneau and Sacagawea, whose language connections and geographic experience would become important when the westward journey resumed. Their recruitment did not occur through chance in a vacant frontier. It became possible because the Mandan and Hidatsa villages gathered people from different backgrounds and linked distant regions through trade and kinship. The months at Fort Mandan therefore reveal the central contradiction of the expedition in its clearest form. Lewis and Clark represented a government claiming authority over an immense territory, yet they spent winter close to communities whose permission, crops, communication, and practical knowledge supported their survival. The fort's wooden walls marked separation, but daily life repeatedly crossed them. Goods moved inward, information moved outward, and relationships determined what could be obtained. When spring approached, the expedition had repaired equipment, organized records, and prepared to continue into country less familiar to American maps. It had not done so in isolation. The foundation of the next stage had been built through a winter lived beside an older center of human life. Recognizing this dependence does not diminish the labor of building the fort or the discipline to endure the season. It places that endurance within the relationships that sustained it and restores the surrounding villages to the center of the scene. What later memory pictured as lonely endurance was also dependence, exchange, and learning within a world the travelers had entered, but never fully possessed. York traveled with the core of discovery from the beginning, but he did not enter the journey under the same conditions as the soldiers around him. He was an enslaved man legally owned by William Clark, bound to the expedition because Clark decided where he would go and what work he would perform. The river placed similar physical demands on many bodies. York rode, carried supplies, helped establish camps, hunted, endured heat, cold, insects, exhaustion, and the uncertainty of unfamiliar country. His labor contributed to the movement and survival of the group, yet effort did not give him the freedom that white members possessed. A soldier served under military authority and could expect pay or later recognition. York remained property within the law, even while performing work that made him appear in practice as a capable member of the expedition. That contradiction followed him beside the Missouri in 1804. The journey is often remembered as a test of individual courage, but courage has a different meaning when a person cannot freely choose whether to take the risk. York did not volunteer in the ordinary sense. He could not simply leave Clark, decide to remain near a village, or return east because the hardship had become too great. His movements belonged to another man's decisions. The open landscape around the boats could suggest freedom, while the social order inside the expedition preserved bondage. This difference was part of what Lewis and Clark really saw, even when their journals did not pause to examine it. A nation speaking of exploration, independence, and continental possibility carried slavery within its own travelling party. York's presence also affected encounters along the river. People in native communities observed his appearance with curiosity because many had not previously met a black man. The surviving journals describe attention directed toward his skin, strength, and body, sometimes through the assumptions of the white writers who recorded those moments. These accounts must be read carefully. They tell us that York was highly visible, but they do not permit later storytellers to invent his private thoughts or reduce him to a spectacle. He was a working human being whose abilities became useful in hunting, labor, communication, and the daily maintenance of the group. His visibility may sometimes have influenced how the expedition was received, but it did not change his legal status within the party. The captains could allow him a degree of movement or participation when circumstances made it useful, while Clark still retained the power to restrict his life. That imbalance remained even during moments when York appeared to share danger equally with the others. Human history along the Missouri had already been shaped by systems of authority, exchange, captivity, kinship, and belonging before the expedition arrived. The Americans did not enter that world as representatives of freedom alone. They brought their own hierarchy, visible in uniforms, ranks, discipline, and the ownership of one man by another. York's body helped pull the expedition upstream, while American law denied him control over the direction of his own life. Recognizing this does not require imagining conversations that were never recorded. The structure itself is clear. He worked, traveled, faced danger, and contributed, but the rewards and choices attached to the journey were distributed unequally. Later memory often places him near the edge of paintings or lists him after the officers, as though he were an unusual companion rather than a person whose labor belonged inside the central story. Restoring him does not mean turning him into a symbol without a life. It means seeing the expedition as it existed, a small, moving society carrying the inequalities of the United States into lands the government wished to understand. In 1804, York saw the same river and endured the same weather, but he travelled toward a future that was never promised to him on equal terms or granted by the nation he served. Sacagawea appears so prominently in modern memory that she is often imagined walking at the front of the expedition from its first day, pointing west across an unknown continent. The surviving record presents a more careful and more human picture. She was not with Lewis and Clark when they departed in 1804, or during most of their first journey up the Missouri. The captains met her during the winter near the Mandan and Hidatsa villages, where she lived with Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau was hired as an interpreter, and Sacagawea's knowledge of Shoshone and Hidatsa made her especially valuable for the country ahead. She joined the travelling company when it left Fort Mandan in April 1805, carrying her infant son. Her presence did not turn her into the single guide responsible for every mile. The expedition relied on many guides, interpreters, traders, and native informants at different moments. Sacagawea nevertheless contributed in ways that cannot be reduced to one title. Her language abilities became essential when the Americans sought horses from the Shoshone. Animals needed to cross the mountains. Communication could move through a long chain. A Shoshone statement passed through Sacagawea into Hidatsa, then through Charbonneau into French, and finally through another interpreter into English. Such a process was slow and imperfect, but without it, diplomacy could have failed entirely. Her relationship to the Shoshone world also carried a personal history that the journals recorded only from outside. She had been separated from her people years earlier and later recognized familiar country as the expedition moved west. When she met a Shoshone leader who was her brother, the reunion directly shaped negotiations that helped the travelers obtain horses and assistance. This moment is sometimes shaped into a convenient legend, as though her life had been waiting to solve the expedition's problem. In reality, the usefulness of the encounter grew from her own disrupted history, from regional conflict, and from relationships existing long before the Americans arrived. Sacagawea also helped the group in quieter ways. She gathered edible plants, recognized places, and preserved important items when a boat nearly overturned. Clark wrote that her presence with a baby helped communicate peaceful intentions because a war expedition was unlikely to travel in that form. This did not make every meeting safe, and it should not turn motherhood into a simple diplomatic tool. She was a young woman performing difficult work while caring for a child under demanding conditions. The journals reveal some actions but preserve little of her own voice. Later generations filled that silence with statues, paintings, novels, and national symbols, often making her either a passive helper or a flawless heroine. Both images flatten the person who actually travelled. She was neither merely an attachment to her husband nor the lone pathfinder of popular legend. She was one link in a chain of knowledge on which the expedition depended. Her languages connected political worlds. Her presence affected how strangers interpreted the group. Her remembered geography occasionally clarified the route. Her labour supported daily survival. Yet she did not receive the formal rank, pay, or authorship through which the captains became famous. The imbalance resembles a larger pattern within the journey. Knowledge supplied by women, interpreters, and native communities entered the expedition's success more easily than their names entered the central national story. Even her name survives in several spellings, reflecting the difficulty of carrying identity across Hidatsa, Shoshone, French, and English records. That uncertainty reminds us that written archives can preserve a person while still failing to preserve how she named herself. Seeing Sacagawea accurately requires resisting both disappearance and exaggeration. She matters not because she secretly directed everything, but because the expedition could not advance through physical endurance alone. It required human connections created before American maps arrived, and she stood at one of the most important crossings between language, homeland, family separation, diplomacy, and movement across the continent. The expedition's progress depended on far more people than the familiar list of captains, soldiers, York, Sacagawea, and Charbonneau suggests. Around every major encounter stood a chain of interpreters, traders, hosts, messengers, hunters, women preparing food, elders recalling routes, and travelers carrying news from regions the Americans had never seen. Some names entered the journals, many did not. Their contributions often survived only as information detached from the person who first supplied it. A river appeared on a map, a village was located, a route was described, or a warning was recorded, while the human source faded behind phrases such as an Indian informed us, or a trader reported. This pattern was not unusual for the period, but it shaped how later generations imagined the expedition. The written record made the officers visible because they controlled the journals, while people whose knowledge entered those journals could remain nearly invisible. Translation itself required several minds working together. A message might move from one native language into another, then into French and finally into English. At every step, the interpreter had to choose words for political ideas, geographic descriptions, kinship terms, and promises that did not fit perfectly across cultures. Meaning could narrow, shift, or become more general. Yet without those choices, counsels could not proceed, routes could not be explained, and danger could not be anticipated. The expedition's famous observations were therefore often collective products, even when the finished sentence carried only one author's name. Women in the villages also supported the journey through labour that official narratives rarely placed at the centre. They cultivated crops, prepared and stored food, processed hides, maintained households, and participated in exchanges that supplied the travellers with what they needed. Their agricultural knowledge helped make the Missouri villages stable sources of nourishment during seasons when hunting alone could not be trusted. Some women shared information directly. Others contributed through the social and economic systems that made information and food available. Because the journals were written by military men focused on movement, diplomacy, and natural observation, much of this daily labour appeared only briefly, if at all. Absence from the page did not mean absence from the journey. The same was true of native guides and travellers who described country beyond the expedition's direct experience. Their mental maps were built through repeated movement, memory, and instruction from earlier generations. When Clark converted those descriptions into lines, the knowledge became easier for Washington to use, but the original voices were often left behind. Human understanding crossed into the American archive without carrying every human name with it. This loss matters because it changes the moral shape of exploration. The journey can appear to be the achievement of a small, heroic group, when it was also the result of borrowed knowledge, negotiated passage, cultivated food, translated speech, and decisions made by communities along the route. Lewis and Clark still endured severe labour and uncertainty. Their records remain important. But endurance did not make them self-sufficient, and authorship did not make them the sole creators of what the expedition learned. What they really saw was a world filled with people who interpreted them, while being interpreted in return. The national story remembered a few faces because monuments and textbooks require simple figures. The journey itself was sustained by many more. Behind every clean map line stood conversations, memories, gestures, and acts of care that could not be reduced to the name of a single explorer. It also requires recognizing that silence in an archive may reflect unequal recording, not a lack of participation, intelligence, or influence within the world being described at all. Recovering those hidden contributions does not require inventing details the record cannot support. It requires reading the record slowly enough to notice where knowledge appears without an owner, where food arrives without a labourer, and where survival depends on someone whose name history did not preserve. Lewis and Clark's journals remain among the most valuable records produced by the expedition because they preserve the discipline of looking day after day, even when exhaustion, weather, hunger, or uncertainty made careful attention difficult. The captains and several other members recorded distances, river courses, temperatures, plants, animals, villages, languages, injuries, meetings, and the changing condition of the landscape. Their notes did not emerge from a single moment of discovery, but from hundreds of ordinary acts of observation repeated across months. A bend had to be measured, a tributary had to be named or compared with earlier information, an animal had to be described by its size, colour, movement, and resemblance to something already known. A counsel had to be summarized after words had passed through interpreters. The journals created continuity where travel itself was fragmented. One day of progress might end in mud, wind, broken equipment, or illness, yet the record allowed the expedition to preserve what had been learned and carry it forward. This careful habit was essential because memory alone could not hold every mile. Jefferson expected information that could be studied in the East, and the journals converted immediate experience into a form that could outlast the bodies that gathered it. They also reveal the physical burden of observation. To write after rowing, walking, hunting, repairing boats, or standing watch required effort. To measure the country while moving through it meant balancing accuracy against danger and limited time. The resulting record is impressive precisely because it was made under those conditions. Yet the discipline of looking did not make the journals complete. Every entry depended on what the observer noticed, what he considered important, what language he possessed, and what his instructions encouraged him to record. A river could be described by width and current, while its meaning to nearby families remained outside the page. A village could be counted without preserving the full web of kinship that held it together. A plant could be collected while the local knowledge surrounding its uses remained only briefly mentioned or not mentioned at all. The journals therefore contain both evidence and absence. Their precision helps modern readers approach the world of 1804, but their silence also warns us not to confuse a written account with the whole of reality. Human life along the Missouri had been shaped over generations by migration, agriculture, disease, trade, conflict, family and memory. The expedition observed fragments of that history while passing through. Some fragments were recorded carefully. Others appeared only through the consequences they produced, such as food arriving at camp, a route being explained, or a tense meeting ending without violence. The page preserved the event more easily than the deeper relationships that made the event possible. This is why the journals must be read with gratitude and caution at the same time. They are not false because they are limited, and they are not complete because they are detailed. They show the country through disciplined American observers who are curious, ambitious, vulnerable, and bound to the purposes of their government. They allow us to see what the expedition saw, but also to ask what remained beyond its frame. The most honest reading does not dismiss the journals or worship them. It listens closely to their measurements, descriptions, and uncertainties, while remembering that every written line stood inside a much larger human world that no notebook, however carefully kept, could contain entirely. The record also changed as the journey continued. Earlier estimates could be corrected, unfamiliar species reconsidered, and reports from traders or native informants compared with experience. This willingness to revise gave the journals strength, because observation was treated as a process rather than a final judgment. Still, revision occurred within the expedition's own categories. The men could improve a distance or description without recognizing the older systems of knowledge that had guided them toward it in the first place. Every journal entry began with a human observer standing somewhere inside the world. He described, "Lewis and Clark could measure a river, note the weather, estimate the size of a village, and record the appearance of people they met, but their words were never free from the expectations they carried west. They were officers of the United States, educated within the assumptions of their own time, and instructed to gather knowledge useful to a growing nation. Even when they wrote honestly, they selected details according to questions already placed in their minds. They noticed routes, resources, trade, leadership, weapons, food, and the possibility of peaceful relations because these matters served the expedition's purpose. Other meanings could remain outside the page, not because they were unreal, but because the writers lacked the language or experience needed to recognize them. A village might be described through the number of lodges and warriors, while its families understood it through ancestry, obligation, fields, ceremonies, and memories tied to the ground. A leader might be called a chief, although authority within his community could depend on persuasion, reputation, age, kinship, or circumstances that did not resemble American command. A gift might be recorded as proof of friendship, while those receiving it understood the exchange as the beginning of duties that would have to be renewed. The journals preserved the American interpretation more fully because American hands controlled the writing. Translation added another boundary. Important conversations often passed through 2 or more languages before reaching English, and every movement between languages required choices. A word connected to land, peace, family, or leadership could carry meanings that had no exact equivalent. The captains might record a clear agreement after hearing a shortened translation of a much more careful statement. Native speakers might leave the meeting believing that they had accepted trade or friendship, not the political authority claimed by the visitors. No deception was necessary for misunderstanding to grow. Each side heard unfamiliar ideas through familiar concepts. The same limit shaped descriptions of appearance, customs, and behavior. The writers sometimes used judgments common among Euro-Americans of the early 19th century, including assumptions that ranked societies according to agriculture, technology, religion, or resemblance to European life. Those categories could make a community seem simple when its political and social relationships were merely organized in another way. They could make seasonal movement look like rootlessness, or shared land use look like absence of ownership. Readers must therefore separate what the journals directly observed from the conclusions the observers drew. Clothing, food, houses, ceremonies, or actions may be described with valuable detail, while explanations of their meaning remain uncertain. This careful distinction protects the record rather than weakening it. It allows the journals to remain evidence without forcing them to speak for people whose own voices were only incompletely preserved. Human beings along the Missouri had inherited ways of understanding place through generations of survival, exchange, and memory. The expedition encountered those ways through brief meetings shaped by urgency, translation, and unequal power. Its writers captured what they could, often with patience and curiosity, but they could not step outside their historical position. Their silences are equally instructive. When a source names the officer who wrote a fact but not the person who supplied it, the absence may reveal the habits of record-keeping rather than the absence of a contributor. When a counsel is summarized in a few lines, the compression may hide hours of hesitation, repetition, and negotiation. Every description was therefore both an opening and a boundary. It brought distant readers closer to a world they had never seen, while framing that world through American aims and language. What Lewis and Clark wrote was real evidence of 1804, but it was evidence viewed through specific eyes, and those eyes could record a landscape accurately while still misunderstanding the human world that gave the landscape its oldest meanings. When the expedition's observations moved east, they changed from immediate experience into government knowledge. Journals, maps, specimens, vocabularies, reports, and objects could be examined by people who had never felt the Missouri current or entered the villages described on the page. This transfer gave the journey a life beyond the travelers themselves, because a measurement taken beside the river could later guide a map maker, a plant sample could interest a naturalist, and a description of a community could enter political planning. In the spring of 1805, material sent downstream from Fort Mandan carried evidence of the country already crossed, including notes, maps, natural specimens, and objects collected during encounters. When the expedition finally returned in 1806, its larger body of records gave the United States a clearer image of the western interior than officials had possessed before the party left. The achievement was substantial, but the knowledge did not arrive without consequences. Once information entered offices, publications, and maps, it could serve purposes different from those of the people who first supplied it. A route explained by a native traveler for immediate movement could become a line available to merchants or later expeditions. The location of a village recorded during diplomacy could become a fixed point within plans created far away. Observations of animals, fertile ground, timber, waterways, and possible trade connections could encourage economic interest by making distance seem more manageable. This did not mean that every note produced an immediate decision, or that Lewis and Clark controlled what later readers would do. Their records contained curiosity, uncertainty, mistakes, revisions, and genuine scientific attention. Still, knowledge gathered under national authority entered a nation already imagining continued growth. The page reduced some of the practical uncertainty that had protected distant places from rapid outside movement. Clark's later maps combined direct observation with information received from native people, traders, and earlier travelers, creating a geographic picture of remarkable reach. As copies circulated, the clean lines could hide the conversations, gestures, remembered journeys, and translated descriptions beneath them. The map appeared to reveal the West through American vision, even though many of its distant features had been known through older human roots. This transformation also changed the people represented on paper. Communities became names, symbols, approximate populations, trading possibilities, or positions in regional diplomacy. Such details were useful, but usefulness could compress living societies into categories selected by outsiders: families, local memories, spiritual meanings, and responsibilities to specific places rarely travelled east with equal clarity. What entered the archive was therefore both real and incomplete. It preserved valuable evidence while separating knowledge from much of the human setting that had produced it. Generations along the Missouri had learned the land through survival, agriculture, movement, kinship, and exchange, while the expedition gathered portions of that understanding into a system designed for government, science, and publication. Once there, the information could support admiration for the continent, but also trade, surveying, military planning, settlement, and stronger claims of national authority. None of these later uses erased the courage or discipline required to make the record. Yet they reveal why observation cannot be treated as a neutral ending. Seeing became recording, recording became circulation, and circulation made distant action easier. The living places encountered in 1804 were gradually transformed into a body of knowledge that Americans could possess before most had ever seen the ground. The record also shaped memory, because later readers could mistake the expedition's organized archive for the beginning of Western knowledge itself. When official documents survive more fully than spoken guidance, cultivated practice, or local names, the nation that stores the papers can appear to have created the understanding that it actually gathered from many sources. What Lewis and Clark carried home was not the land itself, but a powerful representation of it, and representations can prepare the way for changes far greater than the observers who created them could fully foresee. By the time the expedition reached the upper Missouri, the older image of an empty wilderness had already broken apart. Lewis and Clark had passed villages, cultivated fields, trading centers, hunting grounds, diplomatic boundaries, and routes known through memory long before their boats appeared. They had seen a landscape shaped not only by wind, water, animals, and seasons, but by human decisions repeated across generations. Corn had been planted and stored, rivers had been named, alliances had been tested. News had travelled between communities, knowledge of weather, soil, animal movement, and safe passage had been carried in speech and practice. The expedition did not create these systems. It entered them, depended on them, and recorded only a portion of what they contained. This is the first answer hidden beneath the familiar story. What Lewis and Clark really saw in 1804 was not a vacant continent waiting for history to begin. They saw a human world whose history was already old, complex, and active. Yet this answer must remain careful. The captains genuinely encountered many places, plants, animals, and communities that were new to their own experience. Their journals expanded geographic and scientific knowledge available to the United States. Their measurements corrected errors, their descriptions preserved valuable evidence, and their endurance carried them through conditions that demanded discipline. To recognize the older world around them does not require denying what they achieved. It requires changing the scale of the picture. Their journey was important, but it was not the beginning of the land, the beginning of knowledge, or the beginning of human presence. The deeper reality appears when we place the expedition inside the world it crossed instead of placing that world around the expedition. Seen from Washington, the Missouri country was distant, uncertain, and poorly mapped. Seen from the villages along the river, it was divided by relationships, obligations, dangers, resources, and memories. Seen by the captains, a plant might be new to American science. Seen by local families, it might already belong to food, work, medicine, or seasonal knowledge. Seen on an official map, a river might appear as an open route. Seen by those living beside it, passage might require permission, diplomacy, and respect for existing power. The same ground could therefore hold several truths at once. The expedition was discovering for one nation while entering continuity for many others. That distinction changes the meaning of the title without turning it into a false revelation. Lewis and Clark did not secretly encounter a lost civilization or an impossible world hidden from history. They encountered something less dramatic and more important, a continent whose peoples had already built ways of living, knowing, trading, farming, moving, and remembering. The surprise exists mainly in the distance between that reality and the simplified story later generations inherited. It also appears in the imbalance between what survived in writing and what survived through community memory. Official journals remained available to libraries, scholars, and schools, while many local names, explanations, and voices were recorded unevenly or not at all. The absence of those voices from the National Archive did not mean they had lacked knowledge. It meant the archive preserved power more reliably than participation. Human origins on the continent did not begin with the expedition's arrival, and human adaptation to the Missouri did not wait for American instruments. Bodies had already learned the river through labor, hunger, cold, travel, cultivation, and repeated survival. By 1804, the expedition was moving through the accumulated result of those lives. The journals made parts of that world visible to the United States, but they also placed the travellers at the centre of the written record. What becomes clearer now is that the land was never their background. It was already a living human world, and they were the newcomers moving through it. Discovery is never a single event shared equally by everyone who stands in the same place. For Lewis and Clark, the Missouri country opened as a widening field of uncertainty, filled with rivers to measure, animals to describe, villages to record, and routes to compare with incomplete maps. For the people already living there, the same country was not opening at all, because it had never been closed. It was home, memory, food, danger, obligation, and continuity carried from one generation into the next. This difference does not require us to choose one truth and erase the other. The expedition truly did discover much that was new to the government and scientific institutions of the United States, but that novelty belonged to the observers and to the archive receiving their reports. It did not belong to the land itself, and it did not begin the human history of the places described. A river could be newly fixed on an American map while remaining ancient within local speech. A village could appear for the first time in a federal report, while families there continued routines older than the nation, claiming authority over them. An animal could receive a careful description in English, while hunters already knew its tracks, migrations, dangers, and uses through experience carried in the body. What changed in 1804 was therefore not the existence of the world, but the direction in which knowledge about that world began to travel. Observations moved eastward, entered offices, maps, collections, and public memory, and gradually became part of the story the United States told about itself. In that story, the expedition often became the moment when the West came into view, yet this framing placed one nation at the center of a continent filled with other centers. Mandan and Hidatsa villages were centers of agriculture and exchange. Arikara towns were centers of food production, diplomacy, and regional movement. Lakota power shaped passage and trade along the river. Many smaller places held importance through kinship, hunting, gathering, ceremony, and remembered events. None of these worlds depended on American recognition in order to be real. The expedition entered them temporarily, sometimes welcomed, sometimes questioned, sometimes resisted, and often helped. Its members learned because other people spoke, traded, interpreted, warned, fed, and described. Even when the journals placed American movement at the center of each day, the journey remained surrounded by decisions made outside American control. This is why the familiar word discovery can become misleading when it is allowed to carry too much weight. It can describe the expansion of one society's knowledge, but it can also hide the continuity of another society's life. It can honor observation while quietly suggesting that no meaningful world existed before the observer arrived. A more honest understanding preserves the achievement without accepting that disappearance. Lewis and Clark made a remarkable record of a difficult journey, but the people they encountered were not waiting inside history for the captains to give them a place. They were already living through change, remembering epidemics, maintaining fields, negotiating trade, raising children, defending routes, and interpreting the arrival of new powers. The Americans saw them during one narrow moment, while their communities carried past and future beyond the limits of the page. The deepest correction is therefore not that the expedition saw something impossible, secret, or supernatural. It is that the travellers saw a continent already dense with human meaning, then returned to a nation that often remembered the meaning as if it had begun with their arrival. Their maps widened national vision, but they also narrowed memory by making one route appear central, one language authoritative, and one moment of arrival more important than the generations of adaptation that had given every riverbank a place within human life. Discovery belonged to the United States, but continuity belonged to the people whose lives had made the Missouri world human long before 1804. The most useful lesson of the Lewis and Clark journey is not that an old national story must be discarded, but that it must be widened until more of the human world becomes visible. The expedition required endurance, careful observation, discipline, and a willingness to continue through uncertainty. Its journals and maps remain valuable because they preserve a detailed record of landscapes, animals, plants, rivers, meetings, and daily labor. Yet admiration becomes more honest when it no longer depends on the disappearance of everyone who made the journey possible. Along the Missouri, the travelers received food from cultivated fields, directions from remembered routes, political warnings from experienced leaders, and words carried across languages by interpreters. They crossed a country already organized by homes, trade, kinship, conflict, seasonal movement, and knowledge tested through generations. What they carried east was therefore not knowledge created from nothing. It was a new arrangement of direct observation, earlier reports, local guidance, and information translated from people whose names were not always preserved. This does not make the record false. It makes the record human. Every archive is shaped by the people who write, collect, classify, and decide what deserves to survive. When one set of documents becomes the dominant memory, other ways of knowing can seem to have vanished, even when they continue within families, communities, languages, and relationships to place. The educational value of this journey lies in learning to hold achievement and limitation together. Lewis and Clark expanded the geographic understanding available to the United States, but they did not begin the history of the lands they crossed. They described species unfamiliar to Eastern science, but they did not become the first human beings to know those species. They announced American authority, but they repeatedly encountered political power that already operated on the ground. They built a winter fort, but they did not survive apart from the villages around it. Their story becomes deeper, not smaller, when these truths remain beside one another. It also teaches us to approach the word discovery with care. Discovery can describe the moment something becomes visible to a particular observer, institution, or nation. It cannot erase the people for whom that same thing was already familiar. A fair history asks who is seeing, whose knowledge is being recognized, and whose voice is missing from the surviving page. It does not invent answers where evidence is absent, and it does not turn silence into proof that no one spoke. Instead, it treats silence as a reason to read more slowly. The land Lewis and Clark entered in 1804 was not frozen in a timeless past. Its communities were adapting to disease, trade, conflict, new goods, shifting alliances, and the arrival of another expanding power. The expedition itself became one force within those changes, while later settlement and policy would bring consequences far beyond the immediate intentions of the travelers. Remembering this helps prevent history from becoming a simple march in which one nation appears and everyone else fades into scenery. The people beside the Missouri were not scenery. They were farmers, hunters, diplomats, traders, parents, interpreters, leaders, laborers, and keepers of memory. Their lives gave the river its human meaning before American notebooks described it. The final answer is therefore quieter than the title first suggests. Lewis and Clark really saw a continent already inhabited, understood, named, worked, negotiated, and remembered, but they saw it through the needs and limits of their own mission. What later generations received was a powerful record of that encounter, not the complete world itself. Perhaps the deepest responsibility of history is not to choose between admiration and criticism, but to notice how both can guide us toward a fuller truth. That fuller view asks patience, humility, and respect for evidence itself. When the surviving map places the explorers at the center, whose older map of memory are we still failing to see?